Okay, so let's talk a little bit about grief. What does it mean to grieve, and how do I do it? In the past 2 months, I lost my oldest brother and my mom. Their deaths were totally unexpected, and my family is pretty shaken up. This is my first time having to deal with loss within my direct family, and I genuinely have no idea how to grieve. So far, I've just been trying to go with the flow of my moods and thoughts, i.e. cry or reminisce when I feel like it, request space from friends or family when I want to be alone, indulge in distracting, enjoyable activities like watching TikTok or reading fan fiction. I also journal/record videos and audio notes of my thoughts as a way to process, but I don't know if I'm making any real progress on that front as I'm just thinking out loud. Aside from this kind of passive moment-by-moment approach, I don't know what to do to make sense of their deaths or heal. The rest of my family seems to be understanding this through the lens of our religion, Islam, by reasoning that it was just their time to go back to Allah, and we'll be reunited with them in the next life. As I'm not super religious myself, this kind of framing doesn't really comfort me or help me to process their loss in a meaningful way. A large part of me doesn't think that I will ever see them again, and I'm having a hard time coming to terms with such an unfathomable idea, especially because I can't really voice that thought to my friends as they become distressed and uncomfortable anytime I mention doubts about religion or suggest a different way of seeing things. I do have friends that I can talk to about these thoughts, but I worry that I will emotionally dump on them or burden them with my fears. So how do people grieve? What does it mean to grieve? How does one grieve if they don't have a general philosophy about life or a way to understand the world? I think the fact that I don't have a central religious, philosophical, scientific framework for understanding life makes it difficult for me to know how to go about this because death just seems random and unfair to me. Any advice, suggestions, or personal experiences that you want to share are greatly appreciated, and I hope you're all safe and well. Thanks for reading. So this is a fantastic post because it asks a really important question. What does it actually mean to grieve, right? How do we do it? Like, how do we accept death? How do we move on? How do we learn to live? Like, what is, when people like go through this grieving process, like, what does that mean? Like, how do you know when you're done? How do you know if you're doing it right? How do you know if you're doing it wrong? Furthermore, I think as people have started to become a little bit more religiously flexible, let's say, so as a society, there's a trend towards agnosticism or atheism, which I think is totally fine. But I think the bigger trend is not necessarily towards those things, but towards a general sharing and greater understanding of different religious perspectives, which I think is hugely positive, right? So in the past, like let's say 1,000 years ago, your religious exposure was like very limited. And nowadays, like people can learn about all kinds of stuff, right? Like if I want to go out and buy the Quran and read it, I can. I can read commentaries about the Quran. I can watch YouTube videos about the Quran. I can read stuff about the Gita. I can read things about the Gita from this person, that person. I can go to a Buddhist meditation center and like walk in and like learn how to meditate. I can walk into a church. So generally speaking, what we're doing is we're seeing a ton of exposure to different kinds of religious or even non-religious thought, right? So even kind of in the non-religious realm, like there's Stoic philosophy, there are people who are atheists who will sort of talk about morality and like, how to make sense of death and like all this good stuff. So we have a lot of these different perspectives. So how do you know like how to grieve, right? What do you make, how do you make sense of it? Because in the past, what used to happen with grief is that like we would have a large, religious perspective, which would make sense of the world for us. And much like this person's family, people would just use religion as kind of like the playbook for how to manage death. But as we get exposed to all these different like concepts, like we don't really know, okay, which one is like the most correct? We don't know. So as we become sort of religiously more flexible, oftentimes people like this person, right, who sort of grew up in a religious tradition but doesn't necessarily believe it, they're left kind of like spinning in the wind because everyone else has this playbook, but like I don't have a playbook, so how do I do this thing, right? And so we're left asking these questions like, how do people grieve? What does it mean to grieve? How do I know if I'm grieving? So I'd like to talk to you all today about grief. Okay, there we go. So let's talk about a couple of things. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about, It's green. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's go back to white. So we're going to talk about grief today. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to, talk a little bit about, what is grief. We're going to talk a little bit about why is grief hard. And this is going to get kind of interesting, but when we ask the question, how do I grieve? What we're going to do is actually talk a little bit about how death affects people, right? So if we want to get past something, what we need to understand, like if we want to fix something, then what we need to understand is what the damage in the first place is, right? So like if I have a flat tire, then I know how to fix my car because I understand what damage has been done to my car. So what we're going to start with was actually like, how does death affect people? And once we understand how it affects people, then we can sort of move on to, how do I set things right? And then once we understand how to set things right, then we'll sort of understand what the grieving process is. Okay? And and this is this also, we're going to talk a little bit about, science and medicine and epidemiology. We're going to talk just a little bit about death today. And then, if you guys want to, we can touch on certain like Eastern perspectives that are a little bit more spiritual or religious in nature. That's kind of optional. I'm not sure that I want to do this along with the rest of the grief stuff because I think it's important that I feel pretty confident that this part is going to apply to everyone. Whereas depending on your perspective or your belief system, like this part may not apply to you. And I just haven't decided like internally whether I want these things to be together, right? Because then I don't want to come across as being quite objective here and feeling very confident in what I say, like scientifically, and then sort of adding some Eastern stuff at the end. And I just want to make sure that we separate those two things out because I don't want anyone to think that this is just the scientific is like this stuff, okay? Because it really isn't. So the first thing is, so we're going to define a couple of things, okay? So number one, so what is grief? So the term bereavement, and we're going to start with some vocabulary, means losing a loved one. Okay? So this is kind of interesting statistic. So on average, when one person dies, there are 9 people who are bereaved on average. So what this means is that if you look at the average human population, if one person dies, there are going to be 9 people who are going to be severely affected by that person's loss. So this includes like close family members, friends, like best friends, so on average, every person that passes away leaves like 9 people kind of messed up. Next thing to note about bereavement is that it's not always dealt with kind of in the same way. So there seem to be cultural dependencies with how we deal with bereavement. So I'll give you guys just an example. So there was one study that has a super low sample size, about like less than 30 individuals, that looked at parents in the United States and China. And these are parents who had lost children. And so what they tracked these people over time, and what they found is that at 4 months, both parents were about the same in terms of like their impairment and like how sad they were and things like that, how much the loss of their child was affecting them. But the interesting thing is that at 18 months, on average, the Chinese parents were actually like more adjusted or had learned how to cope or were kind of back to normal in a way, in a greater way than the parents from the United States. So like I said, this is a relatively small study, just looking at how different people process grief. We don't want to infer too much about cultural. The purpose of citing this study is not to assume that Chinese people are better at dealing with grief than American people are. It's really to just point out that there is evidence that there are cultural dependencies. And so if you're watching this, understand that what I'm going to be sharing with you may be like adjustable by your culture. Okay, that's really the main point of citing that study. And if we kind of look at like what happens when people pass away, what is the experience of bereavement? So people get all kinds of different symptoms. So for example, they'll have difficulty concentrating. Right? It's like hard to focus on your schoolwork and stuff like that. You tend to be preoccupied with the person who's passed away. So you're thinking about them all the time. You're like having difficulty sleeping and stuff like that. That's another one, by the way. Sleep disturbance. Okay. So you're thinking about them. It's difficulty sleeping. Is this person kind of said, will cry and things like that. You'll get more emotional. So tends to be a little bit more emotional disturbance or dysregulation. So people feel sad more, right? We oftentimes feel lonely after we lose a loved one. And this is kind of important. Sometimes we experience mild hallucinations, which are completely normal. Okay? So it is not unusual to sometimes even see your loved one or hear them calling your name. So remember, a lot of people assume that hallucinations equals mental illness or equals psychosis or schizophrenia, right? People will just assume that if you're hallucinating, you're mentally ill, but it turns out that none of these are actually true. So a hallucination is a symptom, right? It's like fever. There are all kinds of causes for fever. It's like chest pain. There are all kinds of causes for chest pain or even pressure in your chest. So chest pressure, what's the differential diagnosis of chest pressure? Could be myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, or it could be falling in love, right? So remember that as human beings, we experience all kinds of things. And generally speaking, one of the things that a lot of people tend to do is they'll assume that a symptom equals a diagnosis, right? I feel pressure in my chest. Well, like, what is that? Are you bereaved? Are you having a heart attack? Are you falling in love? Like, what does that mean? Similarly, hallucinations, there are a couple of cases of hallucinations being a normal human process, and bereavement is actually like one of them. So bereavement sort of is losing a loved one, and these are some of the symptoms that we experience. It's culturally dependent, right? So these may change depending on what part of the world you live in or what your religious tradition is. And then we get to grief. So grief is the natural response to bereavement. Right? So grief is like the way that human beings adapt to and respond to losing a loved one. So it's also important to note that, grief is not necessarily or definitely a response to bereavement, but it can also be like a response to a breakup, even losing a job, right? We can be grieved about all kinds of things. Getting expelled from school, like it's not necessarily the death of a loved one. And so grief actually has a number of different kind of manifestations. So this is bereavement, right? And then as people start to grieve, as they start to respond to the loss of the person, it's characterized by similar things to bereavement, but like there are a couple of things that are a little bit different. So one is that exploration is inhibited. And we'll get to that in a second. Right, so there's like a reduced interest in life. This is a really actually common one that people are surprised by. There's an unfamiliar incompetence in daily life. So this is a key one to zero in on. When someone you love passes away, it's kind of funny because it's like bizarre, but you just start to feel like you're bad at stuff that you're normally not bad at. So, and this is the thing, is that people will oftentimes beat themselves up, right? Because like they lost a loved one, sure, like maybe your best friend passed away, but your best friend passing away doesn't mean that like you're incompetent at microwaving food or like reviewing resumes. So oftentimes as a result of some of these things like difficulty concentration, preoccupation with loss, right, what that'll end up doing is like make you not as competent as you used to be. And so this is a really common one that I oftentimes see a lot of like shame and like guilt and confusion for this one. But the truth is it's kind of a normal part of the process, right? So like you just kind of feel like incompetent. We'll get to a little bit about why that is as well. So, and then the last thing is that oftentimes when someone passes away, there's confusion about long-term goals. If y'all are very interested in like learning more about this stuff, I think there's a lot of stuff with attachment theory that we'll touch on today. I'm not an expert in attachment theory, but I think that there's a lot of good stuff from the realm of attachment theory about grief. But this is essentially what we can expect from, the grief response. And over time, what we're going to try to do is like, since these are the ways that we get affected, we're going to try to like fix each of these things. Okay. So these will end up with sort of like, let me just think a little bit about, what are the different things. We'll talk a little bit about how, as we resolve these things, we'll sort of go through what healthy grieving looks like. But before we get to healthy grieving, let's talk a little bit about unhealthy grieving. So this is really key, okay? So the grief process, the normal grief process, I'd give people 4 to 6 months. So a lot of people, like, I guess we don't get taught this stuff, right? But like, what's a normal amount of time to grieve? So like, how long should you have this grieving debuff? And I'd say that on average, it should be like 4 to 6 months, with some stuff lasting up to a year. But generally speaking, if you're still having some kind of struggle, like really a struggle, after 1 year of a particular loss, chances are you've moved into the psychiatric diagnosis of prolonged grief. And prolonged grief is characterized by, sustained grief longer than normal, and also impairment of function. So if your grief is really like, it's okay for it to be like making things a little bit trickier, but you should still be able to, at the 4-month mark, be able to, participate in school. Maybe it's not quite as easy to concentrate, but you should be able to do your assignments. You should be able to take tests. You should be able to go, continue to work at your job if you want to. You should be able to exercise, cook for yourself, clean for yourself, whatever your standard is. Maybe you should still be dating or, be able to enjoy going to the movies or things like that. You may miss that person when you're at the movie because you have memories of, how y'all used to watch movies together. But generally speaking, we're talking about, the normal grief process, like these kinds of symptoms should last about 4 to 6 months. And then, some of this stuff should start to get better over the course of like 1 year. And if it's taking you longer than that, then you should seriously consider seeing a mental health specialist and sort of think a little bit about prolonged grief or kind of what's holding you back. So the other thing is that it's not just prolonged grief. So there's evidence that shows that grieving can be a risk factor for precipitating other diagnoses. So for example, 20 to 30% of people who grieve and have lost a loved one will end up with MDD or a depressive episode. Now, what this sort of means, so it doesn't mean that 20% of people, I have to clarify that number. It doesn't mean that everyone who loses a loved one has a 20% chance of getting depression. That's not what that means. What this means is that for people who have major depressive disorder, about 1 out of 5 of them, if they lose a loved one, that can be a risk factor that will trigger their existing illness, right? So remember that major depressive disorder or clinical depression is a case where someone has some kind of like genetic or like, upbringing related predisposition for depression. There may be like some kind of vulnerability to a neurochemical imbalance. So what we tend to see in people who have a depression is that grief can trigger that imbalance. And then they get into the depressive episode, they get treatment, they get better, and everything can still work out. It's not that big of a deal, but it can absolutely trigger an actual depressive episode. The other thing that sometimes happens is that, remember that major depressive disorder is a vulnerability, right? So there's some amount of like genetic stuff going on. And then in the right circumstances, that predisposition for depression will actually manifest as depression. So in some cases, what we'll see is that major depressive disorder, their first episode is triggered by grieving, right? So that's like a major stress on the mind, a major stress on the body. As a result, like it can trigger your depression. So we also see that about 22 to 27% will get some kind of anxiety, right? So once again, about a fifth. So generally speaking, loss of a loved one does not cause PTSD unless it's like particularly violent or something like that, or like particularly traumatic loss. But it does appear that losing a loved one increases the risk of PTSD if something else happens down the road, and it about doubles the risk. So there's something about, the state of grief that forms some kind of stressor on the mind that allows you to be more vulnerable to other things. So if you have PTSD and you lose a loved one, sometimes your PTSD can get worse. If you lost your loved one in a particularly traumatic or profound way, it can cause PTSD, but we do tend to see things like depression and anxiety kind of get worse or sort of get triggered somewhat by the grieving. Okay? And so these two warrant mental health evaluation and treatment. So like this is where, if you guys have, if you've lost a loved one and you're kind of like difficulty concentrating for a few months, you're feeling kind of lonely, like you're having trouble making sense of the world and your life and stuff like that, that's all completely normal. But if it's getting to the point where, 6 months have gone by, 8 months have gone by, you're having trouble getting out of bed, you can't go to work anymore, you're having like nightmares or flashbacks or things like that, or your grief lasts longer than a year, then you should seriously consider getting mental health treatment. Okay? Now, talked a little bit about unhealthy grief. So now what we're going to do is talk about the process of mourning. So mourning is like going through grief, okay? So it's kind of like the process of adapting to and integrating grief. Right? So once we have a loss, like we as human beings need to like adapt to it, adjust to it, integrate it into our lives. And generally speaking, there are a couple of important like components of mourning. So one is accepting the loss, right? Which like you may know they're dead, but like on some level, your mind may not have fully integrated, and we'll get to this in a second, it may not have fully integrated like what their loss means for you. Right? So as you go through your first birthday without them, as you go through your first holiday without them, as their birthday comes up, as your graduation comes up, like as milestone events start to come up without this person, like their loss becomes like more and more known to you, right? You sort of like, it sinks in. And then over time, you'll gradually accept it. A second thing is accepting the consequences of loss. So this may sound like a little bit redundant, but as I was kind of saying, like, as you go through birthdays and stuff like that, there may be like consequences of like losing your parent, right? So one is that your parent may never be around anymore, but then like, let's say I'm a young woman and I want my dad to walk me down the aisle, like accepting the consequences of dad no longer being around can be a little bit different from him not being around, right? So one is that your dad is never going to be around again, which can absolutely be painful. But then there's like all of the stuff that comes with that absence in your life. Okay? And this is kind of a little bit tricky because if we look at people, right, what do people do for us? So this is where we're going to touch on attachment theory for a second. So what do people provide? So what do we get from people, right? What we get is they provide a safe haven, like important people in our lives, right? Somewhat of a home base. They allow us to like learn new things. They allow us to take chances. And then they offer some degree of constancy in our life, right? So like when I say they allow us to learn new things, I mean, obviously we can learn new things without other people. But let's say I'm picking up something as simple as a video game, right? So like if you think about when you start playing a new video game, who else starts playing a new video game? And so you and your friends decide to all get a game together, right? And we're like, oh, we're going to play Apex Legends or whatever. We're going to try Dota. We're going to try LoL, whatever. And so if you really think about it, like having close friends allows you to learn new things in sort of like a safe environment where all y'all are going to experiment together. Let's say you and your friends are going to go, y'all are going to go to the beach and you're going to learn how to surf together. The other thing that people allow you to do is to take chances, close people, right? Because they're going to be there for you. They're going to be some degree of like support. So let's say I want to ask someone out that I'm attracted to, and I go to my friends and I say, hey, I'm going to ask this girl out, like, and they're like, okay, bro, like you got this, like good luck, like we're here when she rejects you, lol, right? So like people provide us some degree of security. They allow us to take chances. Very true for parents, right? So like your parents are oftentimes your safety net. Your parents are the ones that encourage you to try new things. And then people also give us some degree of constancy. So this too is, we'll talk about parents and people on Discord, right? So your parents will, oftentimes you'll go home for Christmas, or you'll go home for Thanksgiving, or you'll go home for a particular holiday. And so if you practice a particular religion and you go home during the time of your religion, like you're celebrating Hanukkah or Diwali or whatever, there's a certain amount of constancy and tradition, and like your life sort of like has this stability which they provide. So even if, things are uncertain in other parts of your life, you have this one source of constancy that people provide. The other thing that's really, really important about what people provide is our sense of identity. And this may sound kind of confusing because, wouldn't you assume that identity comes from within? Well, no, actually, like your identity, a big part of your identity actually does not come from within. The lion's share of your identity, actually, depending on how much into yoga are, you can even say all of your identity comes from everywhere except for within. And that may be kind of confusing for a little bit, but if you think about who you are and how you identify yourself, those all of those attributes don't actually come from you, they come from the external world. So if I identify as like a gifted kid, for example, right? Where did I get that identity? I got it because my parents were like, oh, you're so precocious, you're so smart, right? Or a neuropsychologist tests you and says you have an IQ of 185, right? So that identity, that sense of identity actually comes from another person. So we get described as funny, we get described as, grumpy, we get described as awesome at Dota, we get described as, a one-trick pony in Apex Legends or Overwatch. We get described as all of these things that we sort of internalize as our identity. I'm a smart person, I'm an ugly person, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person. If you think about a child who grows up in an abusive household, right? What do they think about themselves? They think they have very low self-esteem. They value themselves lowly, right? So all of these issues of identity, right? When you're kind of viewed as a good person and everything is going to be okay and you'll bounce back, you're a resilient kid, I have faith in you. All of those aspects of identity come from another person. Actually don't come from us. And so when we lose someone who provides this sense of identity, our identity becomes uncertain. Right? So if you just think a little bit I'm going to mention a couple things that are kind of sad, but let's just take the case of a kid, right? So a kid, let's say a 7-year-old kid who loses a parent. The parent is going to be a major source of, comfort and reassurance in telling the kid, you're a good kid, right? You're loved. And so if you think a little bit about that, if you remove that parent from the equation, how is that identity going to change for the kid over time? There isn't that person telling them constantly that you're okay and I accept you unconditionally, right? So that's going to be a very, very big shock to their sense of identity. So when we lose someone who is close to us, our sense of who we are changes. So the next thing that happens is that we have to change our relationship to the lost object. So I have a particular relationship with my dad, let's say. But if my dad is no longer around, I still have some kind of relationship with him. I know it sounds kind of weird, but I relate to him, right? So something about my life will continue to be affected by him. The things that he taught, the memories we have, the pictures we have, all those kinds of things are still going to be part of my life, right? He's not truly gone because he continues to exist in my mind. I listen to his favorite music. I hear his, I see people wearing his favorite brand of clothing. I go eat food that reminds me of our dad. So then we have to change our kind of relationship to that person, even though they're gone, because they're gone now, right? So we can't have the same relationship we used to have. And over time, as we mourn, we restore the capacity to thrive, right? So generally speaking, and we'll get to this in a little bit as well, maybe we should have started here, but as we start to become uncertain about our future and things like that, we start to worry a little bit about what's going to happen, what am I going to do, as we start to have difficulty concentrating, as we start to have reduced interest in life, as our exploration starts to be inhibited. These are the consequences of grief. So part of mourning And the healthy process of grieving is to start to like restore the capacity to thrive in life, right? Where life becomes like hopeful. And this is kind of the last thing, which is that, looking to the future with happiness and optimism. And this kind of presumes that, you were looking to the future with happiness and optimism before the person passed away. But basically kind of like being back to square one with this like integrated sense of loss. And this is the process of mourning. So when we talk about successful grieving and how do I grieve, it's basically to like go through these stages, right? So the first is you get affected by the grief in this way. The bereavement causes these basic things, right? So like hallucinations. And then if we think about the bereavement is over here and you are over here, there are going to be changes to your person, right? So you will start to change. And that process is grief. As you integrate those changes and adapt, there's a smiley face. It's a bad smiley face. But then as you go through the process of mourning, what we want you to do is kind of like adapt to those changes, start to reconceptualize life. Still a bad smiley face. GG. And then sort of like learn to accept the loss, learn to accept the consequences of the loss, change your sense of identity, like reintegrate yourself, change your relationship with the person who's lost, and then hopefully start to be like optimistic about the future and like, be able to enjoy yourself. So let's talk a little bit about, in general, like what happens. And so this is kind of like a, stepwise fashion, but now I'm going to try to summarize everything, okay? So here's you. And generally speaking, when we try to make sense of the world, our sense of the world is about constancy. Okay? And so if there's a kid who's like learning about gravity, for example, like gravity is actually really reassuring because it always works the same way. So you can count on it, right? As human beings, like we operate most of our life, like counting on things to happen. So I know that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world in COVID, but we still like wake up every day and like I count on my toilet working, I count on the sun rising, I count on my car starting, I count on, my family members being at home. But like my life is organized and makes sense because of the constancy of it. And a huge part of that constancy is other people, right? So if I think about like my life is what it is because my wife does particular things, my kids do particular things, y'all do particular things. So I rely even on, the internet to show up when I'm doing these kinds of things, to watch these kinds of videos. And so everything in the world makes sense. And if there is constancy and if there are rules to the game, then I can plan a strategy. Right? If I know like how to play the game of life, or if I know the rules of the game of life, then I can plan an appropriate strategy. For example, like we have phrases like business casual, right? What does business casual mean? It's like a rule. It's like a way to sort of describe what I'm supposed to wear. So like people tell me, oh, it's business casual. So then I know how to like plan a strategy for this kind of event. Like what kind of people can I expect? Or is it like, do I need to wear a tuxedo? Like, what's the attitude? What's the atmosphere? What's the tone? So we use all of these terms like business casual or like, other kinds of man-made constructs to plan a strategy for life. Now, the tricky thing is that when we lose someone, right? So when someone passes away, this constancy gets shaken up. So if we think about like, I'm planning my future and I'm thinking about all the different things that could happen, but they all involve this person's influence in some way. So let's say like a parent, right? So for example, like if I have trouble at work, I can go to my parent and ask for advice. If I have trouble in a relationship, I can go to my parent and ask for advice. If I run into financial hardship, I can move back in with my parents and they can like provide me with a place to stay. So a lot of the rules of the game that I'm playing are going to be dependent on particular people like existing. And so what starts to happen and what makes grief so difficult is as like this person leaves, then this becomes a question mark, this becomes a question mark, and this becomes a question mark. So then from constancy, we're actually moving to uncertainty. Because this is what happens in our brain is like we wake up every day and your loved ones are there, right? Like it's such a given. But once you take one of your loved ones out of the picture, suddenly your brain is like, I don't know what else I can count on. What can I trust in this world? Right? Like, and so this leads to anxiety. And this uncertainty and anxiety about the future then makes it difficult to do things like explore new things and like have an interest in life and plan for the future. Because this part of your brain is like, I've counted on this person being there all the time, right? Like I've relied on them. I've assumed that they were going to be there. And now I have to redo all of my calculations. What kind of job do I want if my parents aren't around? What kind of relationship do I want if my parents aren't around? What am I going to do about money if I don't have the safety net of my parents? So there's so many things about our life that we sort of assume are going to proceed a particular way because our brain just calculates, just like gravity, like mom is around, dad is around, right? Or even your pet is around. And so you just like count on those kinds of things. But if your pet is no longer there, then suddenly like all of your vacation options change, right? What time you need to wake up in the morning changes. What you need to buy at the grocery store changes. So there's so many things about your life that suddenly become uncertain. And as we become uncertain, this leads to kind of anxiety. And then like this anxiety then leads to a lack of exploration, lack of optimism, right? Because what if someone else passes away? And so that's going to be kind of terrifying for the mind to deal with. Who are you now without this person? And so as all of these things start to change, it can become very, very difficult. And this is kind of the process of grieving that we talked about. And then we also have to start to like reintegrate ourselves after we lose someone. So we have to start to think a little bit, okay, like now that my parents are gone, like who am I, right? You have to reintegrate your identity. You have to figure out who you are. You know, how often are you going to visit their graves? Like, what are you going to, are you going to still talk to them? Like, are you going to pray to them? Like, do you believe they're in heaven? Like, what's going on? So there's just a lot of uncertainty that kind of gets thrown up in the air. And so this person, for example, is talking a little bit about, not being as religious as many other people. And so the cool thing about religion is that religion basically like takes this and turns it back into constancy. Right? So this is the effect of religion. Because your religion will say they're waiting for you in heaven. Okay, so the rules of the game actually haven't changed, right? Because the religion provides you with rules of the game. So if you're an agnostic or an atheist, or even if you're of a religious background and haven't really gone through this stuff, then you're going to be left with uncertainty and anxiety. And then you may turn to a particular religion and you'll find answers. And so like, what do those answers mean? Those answers are going to be like people who find answers in religion, or religion is going to help them do these things. Right? So they'll help you like recognize who you are. Okay, they're going to be in heaven. I'll see them one day. So now you've changed your relationship to the object of your loss, right? They're praying for me. Like my dad is looking out for me from heaven. Okay, so now that my dad is looking out for me, I can start to look to the future again, and I know that he would be happy, and I can like have positive emotions and stuff like that. Right? And so sometimes religious organizations will also provide like a safe haven, right? So you go to the church, you go to the temple, whatever, and there's like people there that will comfort you and things like that. And so this is basically the process of how to grieve, right? And people will say, oh, well, I mean, we haven't talked too much about the how. These are sort of the goals. And so like, how does this manifest? So I'd say that sometimes, there are going to be things like what this person said. So there's going to be like moment to moment emotional experiences. There's also going to be milestones, which need to be kind of like just rethought or re-experienced. So what do I mean by that? This is things like birthdays, holidays, religious ceremonies, marriages, graduations. All of these things have changed, right? So the process of grieving involves like experiencing those things, feeling that moment-to-moment emotional experience, thinking about what does this mean for my future, and hopefully over time, like finding like other things to fill in the vacuum of the lost person. Right? Learning to love again. And then, so there's going to be like some amount of identity formation. So who you are may change in your mind. And so you're going to be kind of confused about who you are because this constant source of kind of identity determinism from the loved one is now gone. So your identity is going to be kind of like confused and not certain what it is. And so you're going to like go through some amount of introspection and going for long walks and listening to sad music and watching movies and maybe going to church and having funeral ceremonies and all these kinds of things, which will like sort of help you form your identity. And then over time, you'll have to learn how to be optimistic. And what does this look like? So you're going to have a tendency to not want to do things, right? You have a reduced interest in life. And gradually over time, there's going to be some weird neurochemical, physiologic stuff going on. So for example, there are studies that show that the immunity that you gain from a vaccine varies depending on whether you're grieving or not. So there are even psychoneuroimmunologic changes that will affect like the robustness of your immune system and make you more vulnerable to like illness. So it's not just psychological, it's absolutely neuroscientific, physiologic, hormonal. There are all kinds of different changes going on. As those changes start to balance and as you start to like engage in new experiences, right? You try something and you're like, oh, this actually is fun. So a good example of this is if you've lost, a partner or spouse, right? And then like, you're like, okay, I'm going to be alone forever, which sort of makes sense. And then you meet someone and you get a little bit attracted to them. And then like you go on a date and you enjoy yourself. And then you feel guilty for your enjoying yourself. And then you're like dealing with all these things. Then you have an identity impact, right? Because you're like, oh my God, I'm betraying my wife. Now I feel like I'm being unfaithful to her. So I don't want to be an unfaithful person. So there are all these assaults on your identity. You feel pessimistic. There's a moment to moment emotional experience, the milestone as you went on a date. And there's another milestone, which is like maybe you become sexually active with a new person. And then you feel even worse about yourself. And then you have to like work through that stuff, right? Like you experience these things, you reintegrate, and then you sort of realize, okay, like actually, they would want nothing but for me to be happy. And they're probably okay with this. And I hope they're okay with this, whatever. I'll talk to them when I get to heaven. Maybe they'll be pissed. We'll find out. And then you start to engage in new experiences. And as you start to engage in new experiences and you go on dates and you start to like, be like, oh, actually, this is actually a lot of fun. Maybe, and then you start to think about the future with this second person. So then you learn how to be optimistic and you're looking forward to holidays and then you're kind of like back to normal, right? And then you've gone through the process of grieving. Questions? Yeah, so maybe some of my random examples, which are used to support the point, are maybe hitting a bit close to home. So I think this is absolutely the kind of thing that, for example, like an interview would do really good at like illustrating this stuff, right? It'd be nice if we could like pair like a solid interview with this, of someone's experience of, okay, I've lost a partner and now I feel like really bad about myself. So then like we would see all of these features at play as we go through the interview. Right? Yeah, so identity is always changing. Absolutely. So the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, I think are pretty accurate. Like they're pretty good. How can I say this? Just as a psychiatrist, like clinically, I find this to be like more useful than the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Just because like it helps, or it has, I assume it's helped my patients, but when I sort of help them understand that like, okay, so your mind, so here's like a summary, okay? So your mind, like as you operate through the world, like as you navigate the world and you go to work and you go grocery shopping and stuff like that, it has these core assumptions. Like gravity. The sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. This person exists in my life. And so what makes grief really hard is that like a fundamental about your universe has been changed. It's suddenly like gravity has stopped working. The sun is no longer going to rise. This person is gone. And it takes time for your mind or your being to adjust to that loss. Because suddenly like now everything has changed. The groceries that I buy have changed because there's one less person living at home. I used to hate these cookies, but they used to love those cookies, and I'm not buying those cookies anymore. My future starts to change because this person was a huge part of my future. We were going to get married. We were going to do this. We were going to do that. So now like all these plans that I had like will disappear. Even my identity changes because so much of who I felt like I was on a day-to-day basis is based on how this person treated me, right? How they responded to me. Like the fact that I feel like a good person because my partner is ill and I take care of them, and like now they're gone, and then like I don't know who I am anymore. So many fundamentals about who we are, how we live our life, how we plan, how we look towards the future suddenly become huge question marks. Everything from identity to like planning for the future. And so grieving and mourning is the process of adapting to those changes and integrating those changes into ourselves so that we can start to be optimistic, start to look forward to the future, and at the same time still maintain some kind of relationship with that person, right? Because that person is going to like live within me forever. So like their impact on me is going to like be there no matter what. And so just learning to accept that you know, this person, even though they're gone, like they're still going to exist in the universe in some way, shape, or form, is like the process of mourning. And so successful grief, you know, give it like 4 months to a year, generally speaking. And then that's really what we're shooting for. Okay? Yeah, so there's a good question. How do you mourn a loved one that you don't really like? And I think that process is still the same, right? So I know it's kind of interesting, but we're making a lot of assumptions. So let's say like there's a loved one that you don't like. You still have to change your relationship to them. So for example, like if, let's say you had an abusive parent. So you may not like them, and so you're angry with them, and you had it on your mind to one day tell them exactly how you felt, right? You wanted to one day like tell them, hey, you've been really mean to me and I really dislike you. I'm very angry at you and I have not forgiven you for everything that you've done to me. Screw you. And you want to say that to them, but you never had the balls to do it or call it whatever you want, right? Ovaries. So you never said those things to them. And so there's some amount of resentment, and like now they're gone. So like there's never going to be justice. You're never going to get to tell them. So you still have to change your relationship to that person, right? Like you're never going to be able to tell them. And so like you may tell them at their grave, you may tell them at the funeral, you may like write a letter and burn it. You may, you may go piss on their grave, like whatever you want to do. Like you can do some kind of mourning attribute, which still involves this sort of scientific attachment theory kind of idea of like changing your relationship to the person. So mourning is like absolutely, whether you like the person or dislike the person, the main thing is that you adapt to their absence, right? That's what healthy like grief looks like. It's like adapting to their absence. And that can be letting go of your resentment, or it can be doing, something disrespectful to them. Like it can be whatever. And at the same time, it's also like in terms of identity formation, if you had an abusive parent, like a big part of that identity formation has to happen anyway for you to be healthy, which is recognizing that the way that this person treated you is not actually accurate. That's not who you are. The way they treated you is actually inappropriate. So it's absolutely relevant for people who you didn't like either, right? It's just major figures in your life that can be negative, and then you still have to reintegrate without them. And so other good examples of things, so when I've had patients who have had parents who are not the nicest, a big part of that mourning involves coming to terms with the fact that they will never patch up that relationship. So for most kids who have parents that they don't get along with, deep within them, there's like a small, very, very like resilient desire to like patch things up, right? You want one day, like you hope, it's like this wish that you have that one day you guys can patch things up. But when someone dies, like that can never happen. And so it's even mourning that possibility, like that hope that you have that one day I hope my parents understand. One day I hope they understand. One day I hope they understand. I had a patient who came out as homosexual, and parents were religious and really didn't accept it. And, poor person was just hoping one day that like their parents would come around. As the world changes, as like it becomes more common, like one day hopefully my parents will accept me. They had grandkids, like, they were hoping to be accepted, and like parents were interested in the kids, but not in anyway. So it's all kind of, it gets tangled up. So oftentimes, even in the case of parents or the loved one that we didn't get along well with, the mourning process still happens, right? Like it still needs to happen. Good question. So there's a good question. So I'm the eldest grandchild, and my younger cousins who are 18 and 13 old just lost their mother. We live in kind of a joint family setup. How do I help them keep being optimistic and not lose their way in the future? So I think that's a fantastic question. So if you're trying to help someone go through grief, remember that you are a source of their identity. Okay, so this is the main thing that I'd say. So continue being that source of their identity, right? So like, remember the way they think about themselves, the way they think about the future are going to be shaped by you. So you don't want to keep them being optimistic. You want to let them lose their optimism and then gain it back, right? So if your 18-year-old cousin is, for example, going to college, like I would sit them down and say like, hey, are you worried about going to college? And think a little bit about like, what would mom do for an 18-year-old who's going to college? Like, they're going to help you move into your dorm. They're going to like decorate your thing. They're going to buy you laundry detergent. They're going to teach you how to do laundry. These are all the aspects of mourning, right? So maybe they still have a dad in the picture, or they have another parent in the picture. And if they do, then like, that parent may do some of it, but that parent may feel incredibly overwhelmed sending their oldest kid off to college. So that's where like, as the eldest grandchild, you can step up some. So you can offer to help them move in. There's all kinds of things that mom would do. So it's like, it can be helpful for you to sort of step up and try to do some of those things. And the signal that you're sending to them slowly is like, even with this loss, like your life is going to be okay. There are other people around who love you. There are other people around who are going to take care of you. All the things that mom can't do for you anymore, like that's okay. Like there are other people around and I'm one of them. As 18-year-old or 13-year-olds start to crush on people, or as they start to, like get into relationship stuff, just be there for them. And so that's the cool thing is, we said at the very beginning that every person who passes away leaves on average 9 people bereaved. And the cool thing is that those 9 people can come together and support each other through that loss, right? So it's okay for them to lose optimism, but be there for them. Try to give them a positive sense of identity, try to be available for them, try to step up and do what the lost person may want to do, but don't overdo it, right? Let them sort of dictate. So it's not like you suddenly want to step into mom's shoes and become the new mom. Like don't overdo it, but be available to them. Someone else is asking you how to mourn if it's been a long time. So like the process is still the same, right? So why do people get stuck in prolonged mourning? It's because they don't do that reintegration. And so how many years have passed is actually kind of irrelevant. Like it may be relevant from like a clinical perspective and diagnosing you with this or that. But at the end of the day, if someone comes into my office with prolonged grief, like I'm going to go through the mourning process with them, right? We're going to do, I'm not going to lay it out for them like that, but the way I have for y'all, but that's what I do in my mind, right? I think as someone comes into my office, I start to think a little bit about, okay, how has this person's future changed? How has this person's identity changed? How has this person's life changed? And then what we do in therapy is we go through each of those things, right? So I'll ask them pointed questions because they may not have like realized this because it's all kind of subconscious, but I'll ask them like, what are holidays like? Oh, holidays are fine. And then they start crying and it's like, what? And then, so, as we start to like unpack that emotion, they work through holidays and then they work through the fact that at their wedding, their parents weren't there because they both passed away. Right. And then what was it like, having your spouse have such a huge part of the family, but in your wedding pictures, like there was never a picture of you with your parents. Like, what was that like? And they're like, it sucked. It hurt. I felt alone. Okay. So like we talk about all that kind of stuff. And I'll ask them, how do you feel about yourself? Right. So I'll ask questions about identity. And so then as like we work through that sense of identity, and then we'll work through like, what does this mean for the future? What does this mean? Like, are you afraid that you're going to lose other people? So sometimes like, there'll be fears that like, okay, what if I wake up one day? Because I woke up one day and my parents were no longer there. I woke up one day and down was up and up was down. And then they're like, what if I wake up one day and my spouse isn't around? What if I wake up one day and this happens? What if, right? And as we get it to the what ifs, what we move to is this, right? So the uncertainty. So the constancy becomes the uncertainty. And so in therapy, we can like work through that stuff. So, okay, so what is it like now having lost them? Like, the world is an uncertain place. That's scary. Tell me about that. Right? And so you can still go through it years later. It's totally fine. It's just going through the process. Good question. Should I grieve about getting bullied? How exactly do I do that? So you can't necessarily, I wouldn't say you should grieve about getting bullied. I think the right thing to grieve is the missed opportunity from the bullying, right? So let's assume that you're in school, for example. So high school maybe is supposed to be fun, but since you got bullied, you did not have a regular high school experience. You had a bad high school experience, and you didn't make friends, and you didn't do this, and you didn't go to prom, and you didn't. So like all of that stuff has to be grieved. It's not the bullying itself, it's the impact of the bullying on your life, which like you have to acknowledge and say like, yeah, like other people got this and I didn't get this. That really sucks for me. I feel really sad. How do you feel about the future? How do you feel about your identity? And so then the other kind of common thing, so this is how some scars form, for example. So super common thing that I see from people who get bullied is a samskar where they essentially are afraid of missing other opportunities. So like if I'm bullied through high school, what happens I had a 20-year-old college student, for example, who was bullied throughout high school. They weren't bullied in middle school, like something weird happened in high school and they became the butt of a joke. And then it was like GG for the rest of high school. And so what they're afraid of, what they're paranoid about is that like something is going to happen in college and then like college is going to be GG. We're going to GG out of college. Because like now I'm going to be bullied at college and then like I missed this one opportunity and so I'm okay with that. But I'm so paranoid about college being screwed. And then also like when it comes to work, they're like, I'm afraid that if like I say the wrong thing at work, then everyone's going to start making fun of me. I'm going to be the butt of the joke at work. So this kind of fear that comes from this missed opportunity in high school sits with them and starts to shape their behavior. Paradoxically, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because then now when they're at work, like they don't make jokes because they're afraid. What if people take the joke the wrong way? What if they start making fun of me because I said something stupid? And so as a result, like they don't make many friends at work and they feel themselves being marginalized. And then they get paranoid because they're like, oh my God, it's happening again. It's happening again. It's only a matter of time before they start explicitly making fun of me. Right? So that's all samskar. So the grieving process is very important because it like digests the samskar. It works through all those negative emotions. So then when you go to work, when you go to school, like you're not worried that something random will happen and you will be like marginalized and bullied for the rest of the next 3 years. Good questions. Can you accelerate the grieving process? Should you? I mean, that depends on how fast. So I'd say like you should give yourself 4 to 6 months, but if you've been grieving for a few years, like I would absolutely intentionally go through the process of mourning, try to reintegrate yourself and like get on with your life, right? So this is where people may say like maybe the right, how can I say this? The right like Twitter, Instagram kind of response is like, everyone grieves at their own pace and you should like let them do that. Like, yeah, it's a complicated process. And that's true. But there's also a part of me that's sort of like, if you've been grieving for 6 years and you're not over it yet, like maybe you should accelerate the process and start living your life. Right? Like I'd say give yourself, that's why we added the time frame at the very beginning. It's really important for people to understand that grief can last up to a year. And after 4 to 6 months, you should be like getting back on, into it. And why do I push people to grieve? Because you have life to live. Right? So like, go through your mourning process, reintegrate yourself, and then start enjoying life again. Yeah, so someone's asking a question, how do I grieve being a 25-year-old virgin? Great question. So this is the important thing. So the problem with 25-year-old virgins is that they assume that their past performance is an indicator of like future returns. Right? Which if you guys know anything about the stock market, you can't rely on. So like this is the real problem with a lot of people who, are 25-year-old virgins is that they make assumptions about the future. Like I didn't realize that being a virgin at the age of 25 allowed you to see the future. Like you can do that? Like that's dope. Maybe that's what what's all the celibacy and yoga is about. I don't mean to be unsympathetic, but honestly, like, you can, the trickiest thing is that you're making this critically incorrect assumption that because you haven't gotten laid at the age of 25, you're not going to get laid for the next 25 years. Whereas what I would say is that you haven't gotten laid until you get laid. And it's just it'll happen at some point. It happens for most people. at some point. And there are 24-year-olds who are paranoid about it. There are 18-year-olds who are paranoid about it. There were 15-year-olds who are paranoid about it, that they haven't gotten laid yet, right? And so things are going to happen at your own pace. And should you grieve that? Absolutely. Like, so you should miss out. You can go through the process of mourning and sort of like, I didn't get laid in high school, didn't get laid in college. Now I'm 25, still haven't gotten laid. Like, woe is me. Sure. What does that mean about your identity, for example, right? It means that, oh, I'm a loser. Like, you may think those kinds of things about yourself. So what does that mean for your future? So all the things that we talked about are absolutely relevant here, right? So like, let's just run through this example. So accepting the loss, right? So like, you know, didn't get laid. Accepting the consequence of the loss, right? So I don't know exactly what that is, but let's go to identity for a second. You know, so you may identify as an incel or forever alone, right? So this changes your sense of identity. It changes your relationship to the object of loss. So sometimes people will start to have resentment towards the opposite sex or same sex, depending on, you know, where you are on the hetero-homosexual spectrum. Restore the capacity to thrive. This is absolutely something you need to do, right? Look to the future with happiness and optimism. Absolutely something you need to do. And this is where, you know, so I think that like the mourning process is very important here, right? Because like it maps on really, really well. And this is why I like this as opposed to the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Like it seems to map on to non-death related mourning processes. But should you mourn? Absolutely. No question. Because the truth is that as you go through that healthy integration, like you'll be able to, as you deal with the resentment that you have towards the people that, you know, you didn't get laid with, you'll set yourself up to like have healthier relationships, right? So I think it's very important. And this is where the person may feel a sense of identity, like I'm a loser because I haven't gotten laid at the age of 25, whereas like that's not necessarily true. It's just, you just haven't had sex. It doesn't, that's it, right? That doesn't say anything about who you are. It's just an experience that you haven't had. Like, you know, I've never been scuba diving. Doesn't say anything about my identity except for the thing, like, is scuba diving cool? Sure. Absolutely. Do I want to do it? Sounds great. But that's all it is.